Hi, I'm Susan Ossman, and I teach anthropology at UC Riverside. Things about anthropology that's really interesting is that you can use experiences that you have in day-to-day life and also use experiences with other people in day-to-day life in the way that you're working and trying to understand both what we might think of as real life issues and theoretical issues that can be explored through day-to-day events. So this is something that's really special about anthropology. We work with things like our own experience, our own interactions with other people, and we work in the sense of a sort of holistic way that is very different than something like doing, say, a sociological survey or a psychological study where we put people in a laboratory environment. So in this sense, anthropology has a lot more in common in many ways, at least cultural anthropology, with very humanistic disciplines and with disciplines like the arts. I actually became an anthropologist after having lived in several different countries, having done some studies in things like intellectual history and art, and being interested in the cinema and a variety of other things, and actually came to anthropology because in some sense it could bring all of this together. It could bring together my own experiences as a person living in different places and a set of more general questions. So therefore it could illuminate my own life, but I think also those of other people. So this is something that's really special about anthropology, and it allows me to move between different kinds of participation in different environments in a way that, say, some other social science fields or even humanities fields might not. So that's why I'm able to, for instance, write about my research. I can write about it for a very specialized audience, but maybe that same research can lead me to write something that's more broadly based that anyone could read. It's something where I can take that same research and maybe write a poem about it, or in my case I do a lot of paintings, so some of the things that might not have been so easy to integrate into an academic article I can express through the painting. So there's a way in which it's personally very satisfying, but there's also a way in which I think this is very satisfying in terms of how we get knowledge of the world, in which all of these different aspects of how we know the world can come into play in this discipline, and that's one of the reasons that it's so incredibly motivating to me. I'm always challenged. And I can always follow my curiosity about the world. You're constantly developing new projects from what you've done before. So you're always meeting new people. You're always doing something new. The worst part is that fieldwork can be incredibly boring. And doing things like writing academic papers can be incredibly boring because you have to have these long citations where you cite everybody who's ever done something on the topic. Think about, there are obviously lots of intellectual problems that you could approach, but also think about what you like to do and places you like to go and what is grapefruit. I always joke about my choice of field sites. I've worked extensively in Morocco and France, and have also, just because of my own history, spent quite a bit of time in California. And so I always joke about how I always chose the places with good food, fresh produce, and delicious wine.
Right.
And so these are things, and you also have to choose your topic, and if you're not the kind of person who likes to sit in a library, don't choose a topic that requires lots of archival research.
Yeah.
Think about what you like, because this is something that you're going to be doing for a long time, and longer than you probably expect.
Yeah.
So you really want to be passionate about it. There's no point in doing it unless you feel both passionate about it intellectually, but also on a more personal level, you feel comfortable with those experiences that you're going to be trying to analyze. Look, there's a lot about that shift because, of course, a serial migrant is someone who's migrated several times. Now, there has to be a first time. Okay, obviously some people may have been brought up in, say, a military family or a diplomatic family. They've moved all around. But in this book, I focus on people who were adults when they became immigrants, even if they were children of diplomats, they continued this lifestyle, I guess is what I'm saying, of moving around even though they themselves were not diplomats. Most of the people I'm looking at then therefore started off moving from one country to another. Our expectation is that immigrants probably are either going to go back to their home country, their place of origin, or they're going to stay put. And then we all worry about them. Should they integrate? How are we going to integrate them? The immigrant is sort of seen as a problem. How does this immigrant become part of the context? Yeah. How do they disappear? How do they stop being an immigrant? And so my question then was, well, what happens when the immigrant moves on? And sometimes, of course, we have different views on different immigrant groups, right? So, if you were coming up from the border from Mexico and you're looking to work as a day laborer, we have a different idea about you than if you're coming, say, from Europe to work in Silicon Valley. Okay, and so a lot of times we distinguish according to economic status. But I also noticed that regardless of economic status, people who move several times seem to have similar ways of talking about their lives and about their stories. And so I was very interested in, they sort of resented the idea that, well, I'm not just an immigrant. No, I've been in several places. I speak several languages. So sometimes we think of people who live in different countries as, maybe cosmopolitans, people who somehow are jet setters, people who move around because they've got lots of means and, they have houses all over the world and they sort of have this unearthly kind of life. And so as I was thinking and doing the research on serial migration, a lot of people came up to me and said, well, maybe we should talk about all of you guys, myself included, the people I'm interviewing, as cosmopolitans, as people who are somehow ungrounded, people who are outside of the normal realm of things. And we should say, okay, well, they're just not locals, they're cosmopolitans. Okay. So this is sort of an image of a cosmopolitan. I call it cosmopolitan content. Efforts to define the cosmopolitan have been at the center of recent debates about world politics, new forms of culture, and human rights. Is he a product of the global market or a reflection of the growth of transnational political connections? Is she a member of an emerging elite or a product of a new world culture? An ever-growing literature seeks to define this elusive figure. But whether we picture the cosmopolitan as a concerned world citizen in a Greenpeace t-shirt asking for donations, or a businessman in an Armani suit engaged in a conference call in an airport lounge, whether we seek to include the exile or the world music performer in this global portrait gallery, all we can know for sure about the cosmopolitan is that disengagement is her defining feature. The cosmopolitan moves from settled ideas or societies or cultures toward a freedom born of a widening of political perspectives and cultural imaginations. Her gravity-defying performance might be understood as a critique of prevalent assumptions about our being the product of the social worlds we are born into. Through him, we seek to recognize that societies have grown beyond the nation, to form outlooks that are not mired in received opinion, and to account for global connections made possible by the intensification of exchange and travel associated with globalization. The movement toward a cosmopolitan consciousness leads to a distanced way of looking at what holds people together at their most universal. A movement toward anywhere creates the cosmopolitan's allure. And some people might not know exactly what thick description is. It's really just a very tightly described scene in general. And there are people who are masters of it. Clifford Geertz, when you read his book, and it's very tight, it's very detailed, but because it's so beautifully written and observed, and whether you can argue about any of those scenes, but it's hard to say that they're not really well written and compelling when you're reading them. Most anthropologists don't necessarily have that talent for thick description, so sometimes it can get very boring. Yeah. And sometimes it can be just a way of, quote, proving a problem, and sometimes that's necessary. Right. So I wouldn't want to say that, but in this particular book, I wanted to focus more on the analytic capacity of anthropology. how is it that as anthropologists we can do more than just describe? Because oftentimes we're seen as simply describing and getting in deep, and I've even heard anthropologists do, sort of the groundwork is the way that I've heard it referred to by people who are not anthropologists. And I think that we have a lot more to offer. I think that anthropology really is, Pierre Bourdieu, a very famous, actually he was a sociologist, but who also did a lot of ethnography and had a background in philosophy, called fieldwork, talked about doing fieldwork in philosophy. And so I think that from our fieldwork we have this capacity to make more general models. And this has not been in vogue in anthropology in recent years, but that's more what I was trying to do in this book. This book, it's about people who've lived in places for a number of years. So people with several homelands invariably begin their life stories by relating their progression through periods of time that they label with the names of the countries they have lived in. It's very simple. Initially, they tell a story of straightforward progress, recounting each move from one home to another according to how it led them to where they are at present, threading places like pearls onto the string that is their lifeline. A common manner of working with intervals defined by broader costings constitutes each serial migrant's experience. This does not mean that those from a particular place or those who have settled in the same places or speak the same languages share nothing in particular. Okay, so those things are still important. Nor does it imply that serial migrants have nothing in common with neighbors who have never moved at all. What it does suggest, however, is that the reiteration of migration leads to particular possibilities for using political and cultural units to shape oneself. By arranging their life narratives in terms of period defined by political territories, serial migrants share a framework for imagining who they are and the subjects they are or might become. Commonality is thus made of forms for problematizing the self, rather than occupying a similar position in a settled social structure or unconsciously transmitted culture. Turning homelands into periods of lives leads to a subordination of place to time. What is it really like to be a mobile person, and how many different kinds of, how does the pathway that we follow as a person in motion, how does that make us who we are? Asking that question is something that actually implies a huge rethinking of how we study migration. And I think that as anthropologists we're able to see and to write about these things in a way that can lead to further work in other disciplines as well. So we can take the lead on this, we can theorize, we can show the models, but we have to be willing to take that risk. And I think that sometimes, because we have been so involved in the thick description, and sometimes it has been hard to extract our models. Why is a serial immigrant different than another immigrant? This is something else that I really, that motivated me to write this book, is a lot of serial migrants say, well, wherever I am, everybody's always saying I'm an immigrant. Statistics just say, okay, you're living in America, you came from someplace else, and all they want to know is where were you born? And when you start talking to people, you realize that there's a story that's much longer, but that no one sees. It's invisible. It's not recorded. And so all those intermediary stages where people think that, this is a very important part of who they are, get blotted out. So attaching ourselves to looking at the path of where people go, rather than just saying, oh, they're a bunch of immigrants, how are we going to assimilate them? Or thinking about immigration as something that's the sort of push and pull of economic forces, but actually looking at these historical moments is really important. And of course, then it brings us to the question, well, how do we look at these narrations in those terms? And one of the things that I found is that in trying to analyze how people talk about their multiple migrations, how people recount a history that isn't related necessarily to one single national history, there are certain regularities. And these regularities don't come from where they're from,
They don't even come from a certain language. Whatever language they're talking to me, I conducted the interviews in 3 different languages, and there were certain things that were common to all of the people that I spoke with.
I assume that people migrate to, quote, have a better life, but what does a better life mean?
Right.
You know, some people move because they think their children will have more opportunities. It may not be for themselves.
Right.
Others move because there were a couple examples of people who felt some form of maybe lack of fit between, say, their religious views and the place they were living, or their political views and the place they were living. And even though they might have to have a lesser, in terms of economic success, they were willing to move and to live in a place where they felt more in sync with the values that they observed dominating in the society they were living in.
Lawrence is a photographer. Indeed, he says he prefers to encounter people through the frame of his lens. He likes to observe others and capture their gestures without having to talk to them. He sees his refusal to imagine himself absorbed in the, quote, local culture as both realistic and principled. Ultimately, he says he wants to move away from people altogether, to return to Canada and retire to the far north, where interactions with others would be limited. But for now, he's thinking about moving to Paris, of all places. I asked Lawrence about his desire to move to a crowded urban center where it is notoriously difficult to get by without speaking the language. Are his motivations financial? Oh, it's not about money, he tells me. It's too simple to assume that people move for money. In fact, at his current job, his salary is lower than it was in Germany. Then what could possibly motivate him to move to Paris? It's because my daughter, he explains. Lawrence proudly tells me that his 3-year-old girl speaks flawless Japanese and perfect English. Now he wants her to learn French. As he speaks of the advantages of early language acquisition, the icy, ironic edge of his voice melts. He's not sure whether staying put or moving around is best for his child, but he is convinced that he must contemplate limiting his freedom of motion if it is best for her future. As I listen, I begin to understand his efforts to detach himself from the politics of class by leaving England as a movement that cannot be understood in terms of an individual action. His flight, the distance he seeks through the lens of his camera, the alienated misanthropic persona he presents, all take on new meaning once he speaks about his hopes for educating his daughter. While he lives in a world limited to English in spite of his travels, he seeks to set her free from the prison house of language. Through her, he acts to counter the pretension of those who would heal the world's problems by assimilating everyone to some universal standard, a leveling that requires people to submit to a common economic system and a politics dominated by the ideas that led him to abandon England, only to find the system he detests prevailing everywhere, and to find himself part of the effort to promote the dissemination of its instrument, his mother tongue.
Where are you from does become a loaded question, and obviously different people have to deal with this question in different ways. If you are an Arab American living in the United States, that's what's going to count, is that hyphen.
Right.
If in between you lived in 3 or 4 other places, well, it's not observable to people in the same way, and it's not of interest. And the whole way we think about immigration leads us to just blank that out. Whereas for the individual, it's obviously so very important. So there is a whole section in the book, as you saw, about this sense of always being somewhat invisible because of that. And so I am made of all of my countries, but what does that really make me to other people? And that's always going to be shifting. Start changing countries into your personal life chapter rather than just seeing them as places on a map that you pass through or you integrate into. Then you start wondering, well, how do I start thinking about attachment? Because we often talk about grounding. Oh, the person is grounded in this place, or they're of this place, or they've been connected or absorbed, whatever those metaphors might be. And once you start thinking about this life story, then you say, well, how do you connect to places? And Gaston Bachelard had this whole theory about the house, very beautifully written book about the poetics of space. So, how is it that we approach the house, the memories that are attached to the house, the fact that the house, we sort of take it with us even when we leave it behind. And the one thing I noticed rereading Bachelard and rereading other phenomenologists as well is that they're always talking about one subject in the world. Me and what is at hand to me, what I imagine. And it's very solitary. And so I started to think about that, and I thought, well, from going from a poetics of space, what is it that we really need to think about here with all of these stories? What's tying all of these people to those places that have made up the chapters of their life? And it's really other people. Now, granted, there are many different kinds of relationships with other people. In this chapter, I talked about it as a poetics of attachment, and the way that people use moving around and connecting people who have been a part of their lives who are in different places through various tactics, like, well, we want to be close to the family, but not that close, so we're going to live somewhere in between, these kinds of things. And then also how this fits into love relationships or friendships. How is it that if we're going to talk about pathways through life as something that's really important, then something like somebody's experience of migration will be very important in their relationship with someone who's close to them. So I talked a little bit about some couples where one of them had extensive experience as a migrant and the other one had none or very limited experience, and how sometimes that could create problems. Or it could incite the person who never migrated to migrate, or vice versa. It could incite that person who had always been moving to, at least stay in place for some time. Or how past relationships would bring someone back to a place that they had lived in before, even when perhaps that relationship no longer existed. So this question of personal attachments was very important. The kinds of relationships. We talked a little bit about how the kind of, say, more general political system that's offered might be a draw. But we also have to think about how certain places offer certain kinds of relationships with others, very specific others, not just the community or the nation.
And I turn back to a text about the poetics of space, by Gaston Bachelard, and some of you may have read this. If you haven't, it's a beautiful text. But it's a text that talks about the house and the experience and the imagination of the house in relation to us. But like much philosophical phenomenology, it's a very solitary world that we are describing. It's a me in my house. It's a me and my relationship to the ground. But it's not this world peopled by families moving all around and trying to get close to people, for instance, moving just a little closer so they'll be close enough to visit, but not moving to the same town because that might be too close for comfort when we're not used to being in the same town anymore. So I found that there was a lot of adjustment of what I thought of as these modes of attachment among the people I interviewed. And so there's a chapter called The Poetics of Attachment. So I say we should go from the poetics of the house or the poetics of space more toward thinking of attachments, or those strings that bind us together. And so, since I've been reading for a little while, I'll go in that chapter to something that's a little bit more personal, and my own sort of field notes, and not necessarily a biographical reflection, not me thinking about, okay, well, what happened to me in my life, in my different chapters, but to my own sort of poetic reflections on this notion of attachment. The value of motion is not easy to measure. The loss of oneself that might accompany moving to yet one more place is easy to recognize. Yet the advantages of repeated settlement are perhaps less apparent. The way a room might offer counsel that is pertinent only when a song once heard is played again. A form of life that makes a ritual of displacement in which a liminal moment shows the friend's face that is the homeland, or one's own face made up as a particular kind of foreigner, whose stories evolve through state lines, but decisions entail reflections on social worlds pictured as circles, grids, or constellations. People deliberating differently to ask the same questions, observing the world and coming up with solutions in terms of these worlds, but also seeing what happens when the values of one world are imported into another. Passing among homes, settling in, moving among political systems that work with world passages to push habits one can't leave behind, addictions that leave little room for free motion or thought, or lead us to engage certain manners of relating to others. A poetics is made of the stuff of experience, but it escapes from the bounds of history, ignoring chronology to notice how deliberation has shaped the whole as an intimation of movement toward meaning, desire, the discipline of style. I found myself daydreaming about what it would be like to be one of those cherished objects one could not leave behind. I had written about what people bring with them, those very few objects that you want to bring. And so I thought of myself as one of them. I traveled widely. I moved as if no wide expanse of water, no soundless sea of words might still that forward motion upon which life thrives. In drawing close what seemed distant, my charms increased with each caress, each man or woman or place enhanced by my custody, because I bore the mark of each passage lightly. I was the magic that passed from hand to hand, the kula shell that rubbed your palms to carry along your trace to others you could not imagine, each partaking in what value I acquired through others, the dream of what I would next become to someone else, somewhere else. I imagine the anthropologist in the image of the kula shell. What would happen if the anthropologist were no longer the careful designer of collaborative projects or a complicit fellow traveler, but instead an object of circulation and barter among those who kept her for a certain time and then passed her on? What would be her vision of time spent in the islands of an archipelago that cannot be sketched on any map because its countries are made of the chapters of a story of settlement? And I wrote of myself. Je suis traversée par des paysages divers, par des langues étrangères les unes aux autres. Je suis éparpillée par les vents et les vagues, par les nuages opaques qui voilent mon visage. Il n'y a que toi, toi qui me ramasses et me ressemble, tes yeux le miroir qui montre un monde qui me ressemble. I am traversed by diverse landscapes, by languages foreign to one another. I am scattered by the wind and the waves. Opaque clouds veil my face. Only you gather me up and put me together. Your eyes, the reflection of a world that resembles me. Thank you.